Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. There are moments when two souls recognize each other across impossible distances, even when everything says they don't belong together. Elias McCord lived alone in the mountains for 10 years after losing his wife. Clara Davenport came west from Boston to teach school and start fresh. When trouble hit their small Wyoming town, he saved her life. In that moment of danger, something awakened in both of them that neither expected. He told her he'd forgotten what a woman smelled like, then kissed her, like his life depended on it. Can love survive when two different worlds collide on the frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and amber as Clara Davenport stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her silk gloves already damp with perspiration. The leather satchel in her hand contained everything that mattered from her old life: letters of recommendation, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the ivory cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. But those silk gloves, now grimy from the 3-day journey, represented something more: the refined world she was leaving behind and the uncertain future she was walking toward. Cedar Ridge. Wyoming wasn't much to look at: a main street lined with weathered wooden buildings, their paint peeling under the relentless prairie sun. The general store, saloon, church, and blacksmith shop clustered together like old friends sharing secrets. Dust devils danced between the buildings, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed in the morning heat. This was a far cry from the cobblestone streets of Boston, where she'd spent her 29 years learning to be a proper lady. "Miss Davenport, I presume?" A weathered woman in calico approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I'm Martha Henley, own the general store with my husband. Been expecting you." Clara smoothed her traveling dress and managed a smile. "Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Henley. I confess, the journey was more arduous than I anticipated." Martha's laugh was warm and genuine. "Child, you'll toughen up quick out here, or the frontier will eat you alive. But don't worry, we've all been greenhorns once. Even those of us born to it had to learn the hard way." She gestured toward a modest building at the end of the street. "That's your schoolhouse there. Living quarters are upstairs. Nothing fancy, but it's clean, and the roof don't leak much." As they walked, Martha pointed out the important landmarks. "That's Sheriff Bradley's office. He's a good man. Keeps the peace when he can. The church there. Pastor Williams holds service every Sunday and Wednesday. And that's the saloon. I'd avoid it if I were you, especially on Saturday nights when the Cowboys come in from the ranches." Clara nodded, absorbing every detail. The school building was smaller than she'd expected, with 6 windows facing the street and a bell tower that had seen better days. Inside, wooden desks sat in neat rows, and a slate blackboard dominated the front wall. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. "Previous teacher left sudden-like," Martha explained, climbing the narrow stairs to the living quarters. "Her husband got offered work in California, left us in quite a bind with 14 children needing schooling." The apartment was sparse but clean: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A wash basin sat on a stand near the single window, which offered a view of the mountains rising like ancient guardians beyond the town. Clara set down her satchel and pulled off her gloves, flexing fingers stiff from gripping them too tightly during the journey. "Why did you come west, dear?" Martha asked gently. "If you don't mind my asking, most educated women stay back east where life's easier." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains through the window. "Sometimes staying in familiar places can be the hardest thing of all, Mrs. Henley. I needed to discover what I was truly capable of, away from expectations that weren't my own." Martha nodded knowingly. "Ah, man trouble then?" "You could say that." Clara's voice carried the weight of unspoken disappointments. I was engaged to a banker's son. A good match, everyone said. Secure future, proper social standing. But I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, living a life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. And so you answered our advertisement for a teacher. I did, though I confess I may have underestimated what frontier life would demand of me. Martha patted her shoulder. We all did, honey, every last one of us. While Clara settled into her new home, 20 miles away in the high country, Elias McCord was splitting wood outside his cabin. The rhythmic thunk of the axe against pine logs echoed across the mountain meadow where he'd made his solitary home. At 37, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent decades living on his own terms, his buckskin clothing worn soft from years of use. The cabin itself was a testament to patience and craftsmanship, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows that looked out over a vista most men would never see. Inside, the single room held everything necessary for survival. A bed he'd built himself, shelves lined with traps and tools, and a small collection of books wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. But it was the silence that defined his world. No human voices, no wagon wheels on cobblestones, no church bells or crying children. Just the wind through the pines, the occasional call of an eagle, and the sound of his own breathing. For 10 years, this silence had been his companion, his refuge from a world that had taken too much from him. Sarah's grave sat beneath a towering ponderosa pine 50 yards from the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross he'd carved with his own hands. He visited it every morning, speaking to her in low tones about the weather, the animals he'd seen, sometimes just sharing the comfortable quiet that had always existed between them. She'd been gone 7 years now, but the ache in his chest remained as constant as the mountain peaks on the horizon. Today felt different, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the light fell across the valley, or the restless energy he'd felt since waking. Something was stirring in the world below, some change in the pattern of things that his instincts had learned to recognize. After a decade of reading the wilderness like other men read newspapers, he trusted these feelings. By afternoon, his monthly supply run could no longer be postponed. The last of his coffee had run out 3 days ago, and his ammunition was running low. More importantly, old Doc Peterson had asked him to check on a sick horse at the Weatherby Ranch, and Elias never ignored a request for help, even if it meant venturing back into the world of people and their complicated lives. He saddled his mare, Patience, a sturdy mountain horse with intelligent eyes and a steady temperament. She'd been his only companion for the past 5 years, and she seemed to understand his moods better than most humans ever had. Together, they began the long descent toward Cedar Ridge, following game trails and old mining roads that wound through aspen groves and granite outcroppings. The town looked smaller every time he returned, as if it was slowly being swallowed by the immensity of the landscape around it. But today there was something new, a woman in a blue dress sweeping the steps of the schoolhouse, her movements graceful and deliberate. Even from a distance, he could see she didn't belong here, carried herself like someone accustomed to gentler surroundings. At the general store, Martha Henley greeted him with her usual mixture of warmth and curiosity. "Elias McCord, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you since spring. You're looking thin. Are you eating properly up there in those mountains?" "I manage fine, Mrs. Henley." His voice carried the rusty quality of someone who spoke mainly to horses and the occasional passing hawk. "Need some supplies. Coffee, ammunition, salt." "Of course. Oh, you should know we have a new school teacher. Came in from Boston yesterday. Miss Clara Davenport, educated woman, very proper. She'll be teaching our young ones to read and cipher." Elias nodded politely, though he had little interest in the comings and goings of townfolk. His business was with the wilderness, not with proper ladies from back east who'd likely be on the next stagecoach home once they discovered what frontier life actually demanded. As Martha gathered his supplies, Sheriff Tom Bradley entered, his badge catching the afternoon light. A good man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, Tom had always treated Elias with respect, understanding that some men needed distance from civilization to heal whatever wounds they carried. "Elias," Tom nodded. "Glad you're here. Been meaning to talk to you. We've had some trouble lately, cattle going missing from the ranches north of town. Professional job, not just rustlers looking for beef. Someone's organized, moving herds at night, covering their tracks. You think they'll bring their business to town? Maybe. Would be good to know you're keeping your eyes open up in the high country. See anything unusual, I'd appreciate hearing about it." Elias considered this as he paid for his supplies. Organized cattle thieves meant men with experience and planning, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses or obstacles. That made them dangerous to everyone in the territory, including proper school teachers who didn't understand how quickly civilized behavior could disappear when money and desperation were involved. As he loaded his supplies into saddlebags, commotion erupted at the far end of the street. Shouts, the sound of running feet, then gunshots cracking across the afternoon air like thunder. Without thinking, Elias moved toward the sound, his hand automatically checking the Colt at his hip. The scene unfolded in seconds that felt like minutes. 5 men on horseback had burst into the main street, firing into the air and shouting demands. One had dismounted outside the bank, while the others controlled the street with drawn weapons. People scattered like startled birds, shopkeepers diving behind doorframes, children crying as their mothers pulled them into alleys. And there, frozen on the schoolhouse steps like a deer in torchlight, stood the new teacher in her blue dress, her face pale with shock, but her chin raised with a courage that surprised him. The nearest gunman was wheeling his horse toward her, probably seeing an easy hostage or target. Without conscious thought, Elias moved, his mountain-trained reflexes taking over. In 3 long strides, he reached the schoolteacher, wrapped his arm around her waist, and pulled her behind the heavy freight wagon parked in front of the general store. She landed against him with surprising softness, her breath coming in quick gasps. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her green eyes, the way her hands trembled despite her brave front. And there was something else, a scent he'd almost forgotten existed. Lilacs and soap, the clean smell of a woman who lived in houses instead of caves, who knew the comfort of hot baths and soft beds. In that moment, with gunshots echoing around them and her pulse racing against his chest, words came from somewhere deep inside him, rusty with disuse, but honest as mountain air. "I forgot what woman smelled like." Her eyes widened, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other. Then, driven by something stronger than logic or propriety, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle or practiced, it was the kiss of a man who'd been alone too long, desperate and grateful and shocked by his own need. Her lips were soft under his, and for just that moment, the gunfire faded and the world narrowed to the space between them. When they broke apart, she stared at him with wonder and confusion, one hand pressed to her lips. The sounds of the real world crashed back, horses galloping away, men shouting, Sheriff Bradley calling for everyone to stay down until the all clear. But Elias McCord, mountain man and hermit, found himself looking into the eyes of Clara Davenport, schoolteacher and refugee from civilization, and realizing that something fundamental had just changed in both their carefully ordered worlds. The wanted poster arrived with the morning mail, carried by a circuit rider who'd picked it up in Cheyenne. Sheriff Tom Bradley unfolded the weathered paper on his desk, studying the crude drawings and bold lettering that spelled out trouble for Cedar Ridge. "Wanted, dead or alive, the Garrett Gang," the poster proclaimed. Jake Garrett, leader. $5,000 reward, known for cattle-rustling, bank robbery, and murder. Extremely dangerous, last seen moving west through Colorado territory. Tom sighed and pinned the poster to his office wall next to the other notices that had accumulated over the years. $5,000 was serious money, the kind that drew serious manhunters. It also meant the Garrett gang was serious trouble, the kind that left towns burned and good people dead. 3 days had passed since the attack on Cedar Ridge's main street, and the town was still recovering from the shock. The gang had made off with $200 from the bank and several horses from the livery stable, but more importantly, they'd shattered the illusion of safety that frontier communities depended on for survival. Clara stood at the front of her classroom, trying to maintain normalcy while her students fidgeted in their seats. The events of 3 days ago had left everyone on edge, including the children. 8-year-old Tommy Patterson kept glancing toward the windows, while his older sister Mary had been jumping at every unexpected sound. "Now then," Clara said, smoothing her grey wool dress, "who can tell me what we learned yesterday about the Oregon Trail?" Little Sarah Wickham raised her hand tentatively. "That it was hard and people died? That's certainly part of the story," Clara replied gently. "But what else? What about the courage it took, the hope that drove families to risk everything for a better life?" The discussion that followed was subdued, lacking the usual enthusiasm she'd come to expect from her students. She understood their unease after witnessing armed men terrorizing their town. It was difficult to focus on lessons about distant history when danger felt so immediate and real. As the children worked on their arithmetic, Clara found her thoughts drifting to Elias McCord. She hadn't seen him since that shocking moment behind the freight wagon, when he'd spoken those rough words and kissed her like a man drowning. The memory sent heat rushing through her in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd come west to escape one kind of life, only to find herself confronted by possibilities she'd never imagined. There had been something raw and honest in his kiss, something that spoke to parts of herself she'd kept carefully buried beneath layers of propriety and expectation. A commotion outside interrupted her thoughts. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see riders approaching 5 men on horseback, moving with the casual confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the leader from 3 days ago, a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes that seemed to catalogue everything as either useful or expendable. "Children," she said quietly, "move away from the windows, quickly now, but don't run." Young Tommy Patterson's face had gone pale. "Is it them again, Miss Davenport? The bad men?" Before she could answer, the schoolhouse door burst open. Jake Garrett stood in the doorway, his long coat dusty from the trail, a Colt revolver hanging loose in his right hand. Behind him, 2 of his men took positions that blocked any escape. "Well now," Garrett said, his voice carrying a soft drawl that made the words somehow more menacing, "what have we here?" "A proper schoolmarm and her little scholars." Clara stepped protectively in front of her students, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is a school, sir. These are children. Whatever business you have in Cedar Ridge, surely it doesn't involve them." Garrett's laugh was like gravel grinding. "Oh, but it does involve them, ma'am. See, we've decided Cedar Ridge is perfectly situated for our purposes. Good grazing land, water access, and far enough from the railroad to give us time to work. But we need the townspeople to understand their new situation." He moved further into the room, and Clara caught the smell of unwashed clothes and violence that seemed to cling to him like smoke. "You're going to help us with that understanding, schoolmarm. You're going to send a message to your sheriff and that mountain man who thinks he's some kind of hero." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said, though her voice betrayed her fear. "Course you do. Big fellow, buckskins, pulled you behind that wagon the other day. Word is he's some kind of tracker, lives up in the high country. We can't have him interfering with our business." One of the children whimpered, and Clara's protective instincts overrode her terror. "Leave the children out of this. Whatever message you want to send, you can send it through me, but let them go." Garrett studied her with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. "You've got spine, I'll give you that. But you don't seem to understand your situation here. See, we need these good people to know that resistance has consequences, and children, well, Children make the point better than most anything else. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his threat. Through the window, Clara could see Sheriff Bradley riding hard toward the school, his face grim with determination. Behind him came Martha Henley and several other townspeople, including Doc Peterson with his medical bag. "Looks like we've got company," one of Garrett's men said. "Expected as much," Garrett replied. "This works out even better." He grabbed Clara's arm roughly, pulling her toward the door. "You're coming with us, schoolmarm. These children can deliver our message." "No," Clara tried to pull away, but his grip was iron strong. "Listen up, children," Garrett called out as he dragged her toward the door. "You tell Sheriff Bradley and that mountain man that we've got their pretty teacher. They want her back, they'll need to discuss terms, and those terms don't include any heroics or tracking parties." As they reached the doorway, a shot rang out from somewhere behind the school. Garrett cursed and shoved Clara roughly toward his waiting horse. "Mount up! We've got company!" The next few minutes were chaos. More gunshots erupted as townspeople took defensive positions. Clara found herself thrown across the saddle of Garrett's horse, the world spinning as they galloped away from Cedar Ridge toward the broken country north of town. Behind them, Sheriff Bradley and his hastily assembled posse gave chase, but the gang had planned their escape route well. Within minutes, they disappeared into the maze of canyons and arroyos that carved the landscape like old scars. At his mountain cabin, Elias McCord was shewing patience when he heard the distant gunfire echoing across the valley. The sound carried differently in the thin mountain, air sharper, more urgent than the casual shooting that sometimes accompanied celebrations or hunting parties. He straightened, listening intently. There another volley, then silence. His instincts, honed by years of survival in dangerous country, told him this wasn't random violence. This was organized, purposeful, and it was coming from the direction of Cedar Ridge. Without hesitation, he saddled Patience and began the rapid descent toward town. As he rode, his mind kept returning to green eyes and the scent of lilacs, to a brave woman who'd stood her ground when gunmen threatened her students. The protective fury that rose in his chest surprised him with its intensity. By the time he reached Cedar Ridge, the immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath was written in the grim faces of the townspeople gathered outside the schoolhouse. Sheriff Bradley met him at the edge of town, his expression grave. "They took her, Elias. The Garrett gang, they took Miss Davenport." The words hit him like a physical blow. "When?" "Hour ago, maybe less. Rode north toward Devil's Canyon. I've got a posse ready, but Garrett's got a head start, and he knows we'll be coming." Elias dismounted, his jaw tight with controlled rage. "How many men?" "5 that we've seen. There might be more." "There are." Elias studied the tracks in the dirt, reading the story they told. "These horses are fresh, but they're carrying extra weight. They've got supplies for a long stay, which means they're not just passing through. They're setting up somewhere." Tom nodded grimly. "That's what I figured. Question is, where?" Elias was already moving, examining the hoofprints and broken vegetation that marked the gang's passage. His years in the mountains had taught him to read sign like other men read books, and what he saw here told a clear story of confident men who weren't particularly worried about being followed. "Devil's Canyon," he said finally. "There's only 3 ways out once you're in there, and 2 of them require ropes. If they're planning to stay in the territory, that's where they'd fought up. Can you track them?" Elias looked toward the north, where the broken country rose in jumbled ridges and hidden valleys. Somewhere in that maze of stone and shadow, dangerous men held a woman whose courage had touched something in him he'd thought dead and buried. "I can track them," he said quietly. "Question is whether you want them brought back alive." The sheriff studied the mountain man's face, seeing something there that hadn't been present 3 days ago. "I want Miss Davenport back safely. How you accomplish that is up to you." Elias nodded and remounted Patience. As he rode north toward the broken country, one thought echoed in his mind like a prayer. He'd forgotten what woman smelled like, but he'd be damned if he'd forget what woman felt like in his arms. Not again. Not ever again. Clara found herself bound and seated against a boulder in what the outlaws called Devil's Canyon, a maze of red rock walls that rose like ancient cathedrals around their makeshift camp. Her captors had been riding hard for 2 hours, following game trails and creek beds that would make tracking difficult even for an experienced frontiersman. Jake Garrett crouched beside a small fire, studying a hand-drawn map while his men tended their horses and cleaned their weapons. The casual efficiency of their movements told Clara these were experienced outlaws, men who'd made a profession of violence and theft. "Comfortable, schoolmarm?" Garrett asked without looking up from his map. "As comfortable as one can be when kidnapped by criminals," Clara replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Garrett chuckled. "Got spirit, I'll give you that. Most Eastern ladies would be crying by now." He folded the map and stood, walking over to where she sat. "Question is, how much is that spirit worth to your mountain man friend?" "I hardly know, Mr. McCord, if you think he'll risk his life for a stranger." "Oh, but you're not strangers, are you?" Garrett's eyes held a knowing glint. "My boys saw that little scene behind the freight wagon. Man doesn't kiss a woman like that unless she means something to him." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. "You're mistaken. It was merely the confusion of the moment. Maybe. Guess we'll find out soon enough." 20 miles away, Elias knelt beside a stream where the gang's horses had stopped to drink. The tracks told him they were moving with purpose, not randomly fleeing. These men knew the country, or at least one of them did. More troubling, they seemed confident enough to take time for rest stops, which suggested they weren't particularly worried about pursuit. His hand went unconsciously to the worn gold band he still wore on a leather cord around his neck. Sarah's wedding ring, the one physical reminder of the life they'd shared. For 7 years, it had been a weight of memory and guilt, a chain that bound him to the past. Now, for the first time since her death, he felt the stirring of something that might challenge that bond. Sarah had been 19 when they married, mountain-born and raised to frontier life. She'd known how to read weather and sign, could skin a deer and birth a calf with equal skill. She died in a blizzard while he was away checking trap lines, caught by a sudden storm that turned their valley into a white hell. He'd found her 3 days later, frozen in their cabin, and the guilt had nearly destroyed him. Clara Davenport was everything Sarah hadn't been: educated, refined, born to gentler circumstances. Yet, there had been something in her eyes during that moment of danger, a core of strength that reminded him what it felt like to want to protect someone, to feel responsible for another person's happiness and safety. The tracks led deeper into the broken country, following deer paths and ancient stream beds that would challenge even an experienced tracker. But Elias had spent 10 years learning to read this landscape like scripture, and every broken twig and displaced stone told him part of the story. In Cedar Ridge, the aftermath of the kidnapping had galvanized the community in ways that surprised everyone. Martha Henley organized the women to prepare supplies for any rescue effort, while Doc Peterson readied his medical kit for potential casualties. Even Pastor Williams, a man more comfortable with sermons than violence, cleaned his old army rifle and offered to join any posse. Sheriff Bradley sat in his office, staring at the wanted poster and calculating odds. The Garrett gang had been operating for 3 years, leaving a trail of robbery and murder across Colorado and Wyoming territories. They were smart, experienced, and utterly ruthless. Against them, he could field perhaps 8 or 10 men, most of them more familiar with cattle than gunfighting. But then there was Elias McCord, and that changed the equation considerably. Bradley had known the mountain man for 5 years, ever since he'd first appeared in Cedar Ridge like a ghost emerging from the high country. There were stories about Elias's past hints that he'd been more than just a trapper before his self-imposed exile, whispers about skills that went beyond tracking and hunting. The truth was, Elias McCord was the only man in 200 miles who might be able to find the Garrett gang's hideout and bring Clara Davenport home alive. The question was whether he'd risk everything for a woman he'd known for less than a week. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elias found where the gang had stopped for their first extended rest. They'd chosen a hidden grove beside a spring, screened by cottonwoods and protected by natural rock barriers. The signs told him Clara was unharmed but frightened. Her footprints showed she'd been allowed to walk around, though always under guard. More importantly, he'd identified their destination. The tracks pointed toward Devil's Canyon, a natural fortress that had been used by Apaches, outlaws, and army deserters for generations. There were only 3 ways into the canyon, and all of them were easily defended by men with rifles and patience. But Elias knew something the Garrett gang probably didn't. There was a 4th way in, a narrow chimney climb that few men would attempt and fewer still would survive. It was the kind of route that required absolute trust in your equipment and a willingness to risk everything on handholds worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. As he made camp that evening, still hours away from the canyon, Elias found himself remembering Sarah's voice. She'd always been practical about death, accepting it as part of mountain life, the way she accepted harsh winters and dry summers. "When my time comes," she'd told him once while they watched snow fall outside their cabin, "don't you spend the rest of your life mourning me. Promise me that, Elias. Promise me you'll find reason to keep living." He'd made that promise, but keeping it had proved harder than either of them had imagined. For 7 years, he'd existed rather than lived, maintaining his body while letting his heart grow cold as winter stone. Now, as he prepared to risk everything for a woman who'd been a stranger 4 days ago, he wondered if Sarah would approve. The thought brought a bitter smile to his lips. Sarah had always been generous with her affections, quick to welcome strangers and slower to judge than most frontier women. She probably would have liked Clara Davenport, would have admired her courage in coming west alone and her determination to build something meaningful from the raw materials of frontier life. The stars emerged one by one above the broken country, and somewhere among those twisted canyons and hidden valleys, brave men held a brave woman captive. Tomorrow would bring the kind of violence that defined frontier justice, the sort of reckoning that left some men dead and others forever changed. Elias checked his weapons, the Colt at his hip, the rifle across his saddle, the hunting knife that had saved his life more times than he could count. Then he settled back against his saddle and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow he would discover whether a man could love twice in one lifetime, and whether some promises were worth breaking in order to keep others. Clara's teaching slate lay forgotten in the abandoned schoolhouse, its surface still marked with the day's arithmetic lesson. The children had scattered when the Garrett gang arrived, running home to frightened parents who now kept loaded rifles beside their kitchen tables and jumped at every unexpected sound. In the canyon, Clara observed her captors with the methodical attention she'd once devoted to lesson planning. Knowledge, she'd learned, was often the difference between life and death, and these men held her life in their calloused hands. Jake Garrett was clearly the leader, older, more calculating than the others, with the kind of patience that made him dangerous. His second in command, a lean man called Pike, watched her with predatory eyes that made her skin crawl. The other 3 were followers, dangerous in their unpredictability, but lacking the cold intelligence that made Garrett truly terrifying. They'd been riding together long enough to work as a unit, but not so long that they'd lost their individual edges of cruelty and greed. "Tell me about your mountain man," Garrett said, settling beside the fire as evening shadows crept across the canyon floor. "There's nothing to tell. I barely know him. But you know enough to let him kiss you in front of half the town." Garrett's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. "Man like that doesn't show himself unless he's got reason. Question is, What kind of reason? Clara remained silent, but her mind was racing. The truth was, she didn't understand what had passed between her and Elias McCord any more than Garrett did. The kiss had been impulsive, born from danger and proximity, but there had been something deeper in it, a recognition that transcended rational thought. "He'll come," Pike said from across the fire. "Mountain men are territorial about their women. He'll come, and when he does, we'll be ready." "Maybe," Garrett said thoughtfully, "or maybe he's smart enough to know 5 against 1 isn't good odds, no matter how handy he is with that Colt." As night settled over the canyon, Clara found herself thinking about her students. Were they safe? Had their parents managed to calm their fears, or were they lying awake, wondering if the bad men would come back? The thought of those trusting young faces gave her strength, even as her situation grew more precarious. Miles away, Elias had reached the rim of Devil's Canyon. Below him, the maze of red rock walls twisted and turned like a serpent carved from stone. Somewhere in that labyrinth, Clara Davenport waited for rescue or death, and 5 desperate men prepared to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt either. The main entrance to the canyon was a narrow gap between towering walls, easily defended and impossible to approach without being seen. The second entrance was little better, a steep trail that switched back down the eastern wall, exposed to rifle fire for most of its length. The third was a treacherous descent that required ropes and skill, but ended in a box canyon with no way out. But the fourth way, the route Elias had discovered during his early years in the mountains, was different. It was a chimney climb up the back wall of the canyon, a vertical crack in the rock face that a man could wedge himself into and climb by pressing his back against one wall and his feet against the other. It was dangerous, exhausting, and would leave him exposed if anyone happened to look up at the wrong moment. It was also his only chance of reaching Clara before the gang decided she was more trouble than she was worth. As he prepared his equipment, Elias found himself thinking about the woman who disrupted his carefully ordered solitude. There had been courage in her eyes when she faced down armed men to protect her students, the kind of quiet bravery that reminded him why some things were worth fighting for. Sarah had possessed that same courage, the frontier woman's ability to face hardship without complaint and danger without panic. But where Sarah had been shaped by mountain life from birth, Clara had chosen to embrace the frontier, despite being raised for gentler circumstances. That choice, Elias realized, might require even greater courage. The climb began just after midnight, when the moon was high enough to provide light, but the camp below would be settled into sleep patterns. Elias moved like a shadow up the rock face, his muscles burning with the effort of supporting his weight against gravity's relentless pull. Halfway up, he paused to rest, pressed into the narrow chimney like a fly on a wall. Below him, the canyon floor lay in darkness, broken only by the dying embers of the gang's fire. He could make out the shapes of sleeping men wrapped in blankets, and the smaller figure that had to be Clara, positioned where any escape attempt would wake her guards. The final 100 feet were the worst, where the chimney narrowed and the rock became smooth from centuries of water flow. By the time he reached the canyon floor, Elias was exhausted, and his buckskin shirt was torn in 3 places. But he was inside their perimeter, and that changed everything. He spent an hour observing the camp, learning the rhythm of the guards, and identifying escape routes. Pike was on watch, making a slow circuit of the camp every 15 minutes. The others slept heavily, confident in their position and their leader's planning. Clara lay apart from the outlaws, her hands bound but her spirit unbroken. Even in sleep, she maintained the dignity that had first caught his attention, as if her breeding and education were armor against the degradation of captivity. As dawn approached, Elias made his decision. A direct assault would likely result in Clara's death. Desperate men used hostages as shields, and Garrett struck him as the type who'd kill her rather than lose his advantage. But there might be another way, a strategy that would require patience and nerve, but offered better odds of success. He retreated to a position where he could watch the camp without being seen and settled in to wait. Rescue, he'd learned during his years in the mountains, was often a matter of timing rather than firepower. The right moment could make one man worth five, while the wrong moment could turn heroes into corpses. As the sun rose over Devil's Canyon, painting the red rock walls in shades of gold and copper, Elias began the most important hunt of his life. But this time, he wasn't tracking animals for food or pelts. This time, he was hunting dangerous men who held something more precious than gold, the possibility of a future he'd thought buried forever in a mountain grave. The waiting began, and with it, the slow, careful dance between hunter and prey that would determine whether Clara Davenport lived to teach another class or died forgotten in a canyon that had already claimed too many lives. The hand-carved wooden horse was no bigger than a man's thumb, whittled from pine and smoothed to silk by patient hands. Elias had crafted it during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the canyon and sleep came hard. It was meant for little Sarah Wickham, Clara's youngest student, who'd shown him kindness the few times he'd ventured into town. Now, as he watched the outlaw camp from his hidden position among the rocks, the small horse felt like a talisman in his pocket, a reminder of gentler purposes and the life that waited beyond this deadly game of patience and positioning. Clara had been captive for 36 hours, and the strain was beginning to show. Even from his distant vantage point, Elias could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way she held herself carefully upright despite the ropes that bound her wrists. But her spirit remained unbroken, evident in the straight line of her shoulders and the defiant tilt of her chin when Garrett addressed her. The gang leader had grown increasingly agitated as the hours passed without sign of pursuit. Twice he'd sent scouts to the canyon rim to watch for approaching riders, and both times they'd returned empty-handed. It was clear that Garrett's confidence in his hostage's value was beginning to waver. "Maybe your mountain man ain't as fond of you as we thought," Pike said during the midday meal, his voice carrying across the canyon floor to where Elias lay concealed. "Or maybe he's smarter than you gave him credit for," Clara replied calmly. "Perhaps he realizes that charging into an obvious trap isn't the best way to help anyone." Garrett's laugh was harsh. "Smart, maybe. But if he doesn't show himself soon, we might have to send a different kind of message to your sheriff friends." The threat hung in the air like smoke from their fire, and Elias felt his jaw tighten with controlled rage. He'd spent the previous night moving closer to the camp, identifying weaknesses in their perimeter and planning multiple approaches. But every scenario he considered ended with Clara in the line of fire, and that was a risk he couldn't accept. As afternoon shadows crept across the canyon, an opportunity finally presented itself. Two of the gang members, a stocky man called Bronson and a younger outlaw who answered to Kid, decided to explore a side canyon they'd spotted during their arrival. Garrett agreed to let them go, reducing his force from 5 to 3 and spreading his remaining men thinner. Elias watched them ride out, noting their direction and estimating their likely return time. This was the break he'd been waiting for, but it would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. As the exploring party disappeared into the maze of side canyons, Elias began his approach. He moved like a ghost through the broken rock, using every shadow and depression to mask his advance. The skills that had kept him alive in hostile country for 15 years, first as a soldier, then as a frontiersman, served him well in this deadliest of games. Clara sensed the change before she saw anything concrete. Some shift in the quality of silence, perhaps, or the subtle alteration in bird calls that often announced a predator's presence. She'd learned to read such signs during her months on the frontier, where survival often depended on paying attention to details that city dwellers missed. When she finally spotted movement among the rocks above the camp, her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and terror. Elias McCord was here, alone against 3 armed men, risking everything for a woman he barely knew. The reality of his presence brought home the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't a romantic adventure from one of her novels, but a life-and-death struggle that could end in tragedy for everyone involved. She forced herself to remain calm, knowing that any sign of recognition could alert her captors to the danger creeping toward them through the maze of stone and shadow. Instead, she focused on appearing dispirited and defeated, hoping to maintain the outlaw's confidence while Elias maneuvered into position. "You're mighty quiet, schoolmarm," Pike observed, settling beside the fire with a cup of coffee. "Finally, realizing your situation? I'm trying to understand why intelligent men would choose a life that can only end in violence," Clara replied honestly. "Surely there are easier ways to make a living." Garrett looked up from the map he'd been studying. "Easier maybe, but not more profitable. We've pulled down more money in the past year than most men see in a lifetime. And how many men have you killed for that money? Enough to know it gets easier with practice," Pike said with a cold smile. The casual admission of murder sent a chill through Clara, but she kept her voice steady. "And you sleep well at night? Like a baby," Garrett said. "Money's better than conscience for helping a man rest peaceful." From his position 50 yards away, Elias had a clear view of the camp and its occupants. Clara sat with her back to a large boulder, positioned so that any rescue attempt would have to come from the front, through open ground covered by the outlaw's rifles. It was a professional setup, designed to discourage exactly the kind of heroics he was contemplating. But Elias had learned patience during his years alone in the mountains, the kind of deep, abiding patience that could wait days for the perfect shot or the ideal moment to move. He settled into position and began the hardest part of any hunt, waiting for his prey to make the mistake that would give him his chance. The mistake came an hour later, when nature called and Pike decided to answer it away from the main camp. As the outlaw walked toward a cluster of boulders that would provide privacy, he passed within 15 feet of Elias's hiding place. The attack was swift and silent. Elias emerged from concealment like a mountain cat, his arms snaking around Pike's throat before the man could cry out. A few seconds of struggle, and Pike went limp, unconscious but alive. Elias lowered him to the ground and quickly bound him with his own belt, stuffing a gag made from the outlaw's bandana into his mouth. 1 down, 2 to go. But now the real challenge began, because the remaining outlaws would notice Pike's absence eventually, and when they did, the advantage of surprise would be lost. Elias retreated to a new position, closer to the main camp, but still concealed among the tumbled rocks. From here, he could see Clara clearly, could read the tension in her posture and the way she glanced occasionally toward the spot where Pike had disappeared. She knew something had changed, even if she couldn't be certain what. That awareness, that quickness of mind that had impressed him from their first meeting, might be the edge they needed to survive what was coming next. As the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the broken ground, Elias prepared for the next phase of his impossible rescue. 2 outlaws remained, both alert and suspicious, both positioned to use Clara as a shield if threatened. But he had something they didn't: the patience of a hunter and the desperation of a man who'd finally found something worth dying for. Clara's mother's cameo brooch caught the last rays of sunlight filtering into Devil's Canyon, its carved ivory surface reflecting light like a tiny beacon against her torn dress. The brooch had been a wedding gift from her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of proper Boston women who'd never imagined their descendant would find herself bound and captive in a Wyoming canyon. She fingered the brooch carefully, working at the clasp with movements so small they wouldn't attract attention. The pin was sharp enough to cut rope if given time and pressure. More importantly, it represented something her captors wouldn't expect: the possibility that a refined Eastern lady might possess the will and ingenuity to help engineer her own rescue. "Where the hell is Pike?" Garrett muttered, checking his pocket watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The outlaw leader's patience was wearing thin, and that made him dangerous in ways that went beyond mere violence. "Maybe he fell asleep," suggested the remaining gang member, a nervous young man who'd been growing increasingly jumpy as the afternoon wore on. "Pike, don't fall asleep on watch," Garrett said flatly. "Something's wrong." Clara kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. If Elias was out there, and she was increasingly certain he was, then Pike's absence could only mean one thing. The rescue she'd hoped for was beginning, and with it, the most dangerous hours of her captivity. Garrett stood and checked his rifle, working the lever action with practiced ease. "Tommy, you circle around and find Pike. If you see anything that don't belong, you come back shooting. Understand?" Tommy nodded nervously and grabbed his Winchester. As he headed toward the area where Pike had disappeared, Clara caught a glimpse of movement among the rocks above the camp. Just a shadow shifting against shadow, but enough to confirm what she'd suspected. "Mighty quiet, schoolmarm," Garrett observed, settling back down with his rifle across his knees. "Almost like you're expecting something to happen." "I'm praying," Clara said truthfully. "It's what proper ladies do in difficult circumstances." "Pray all you want. Won't change the fact that your mountain man friend has gotten himself in over his head. 5 against 1 ain't good odds, no matter how tough he thinks he is." "Perhaps he's not alone," Clara suggested carefully. Garrett's laugh was harsh. "Sheriff Bradley and a bunch of storekeepers, they'd never make it past the canyon mouth without losing half their number. No, if your friend's out there, he's working solo, and that means he's about to make the last mistake of his life." A shot rang out from the direction Tommy had gone, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Garrett was on his feet instantly, his rifle ready as he scanned the rocks above the camp. "Tommy!" he called out. No answer came back, except the fading echo of the gunshot. Clara worked frantically at her bonds with the cameo's pin, feeling the rough rope fibers begin to separate under the sharp ivory edge. The shot meant the situation was escalating rapidly, and she needed to be ready to move when the opportunity came. "Damn it," Garrett cursed, realizing his force had been reduced from 5 men to 1 in the space of 2 hours. His confidence was cracking, replaced by the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "McCord!" he shouted toward the canyon walls. "I know you're out there. You want the woman. You come down here and face me like a man." Silence answered him, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. "Maybe he can't hear you," Clara suggested mildly, continuing to work at her ropes. Garrett spun toward her, his eyes wild with rage and fear. "Shut up, just shut up and let me think." He grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, hauling her to her feet. "You're coming with me. We're getting out of this canyon, and if your mountain man tries to stop us, I'll put a bullet in your spine." Clara felt the last strands of rope give way, but she kept her hands positioned as if still bound. "Where exactly do you plan to go? You've been riding with this gang for years. Every lawman in 3 territories knows your face." "Mexico," Garrett said, dragging her toward where the horses were picketed. "Plenty of places a man can disappear south of the border, especially a man with money to spend." As they moved across the camp, Clara caught sight of movement among the rocks, a brief glimpse of buckskin and the gleam of metal. Elias was positioning himself for a shot, but Garrett was using her as a human shield, staying directly behind her as they approached the horses. "You're making a mistake," Clara said, stalling for time. "Even if you escape, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Is that any way to live?" "Better than being dead," Garrett replied, but there was doubt in his voice now. The careful plan that had brought him to this canyon was falling apart, and he was smart enough to know it. Clara made her decision. As they reached the horses, she suddenly went limp, dropping her full weight against Garrett's arm. The unexpected move threw him off balance, and for just a moment, Clara was clear of his line of fire. The rifle shot came from above, the bullet striking Garrett in the shoulder and spinning him around. He cursed and tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but Clara was already moving, rolling behind the horses and putting as much distance as possible between herself and the wounded outlaw. Garrett fired wildly at the rocks above, his shots echoing uselessly off stone. A second bullet from Elias's rifle took him in the leg, dropping him to one knee but not stopping his desperate attempt to locate his attacker. "Give it up, Garrett," Elias's voice rang out from the canyon walls. "Your men are down, you're wounded, and there's nowhere to run." "Go to hell," Garrett screamed back, still firing randomly at the surrounding rocks. Clara had reached the relative safety of a boulder pile, her heart pounding with adrenaline and relief. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see Elias making his way down from his elevated position, moving with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in dangerous terrain. The final confrontation was swift and decisive. Garrett, weakened by blood loss and consumed by rage, made the mistake of exposing himself as he tried to get a clear shot at Elias. The mountain man's rifle spoke once more, and Jake Garrett fell forward into the dust, his reign of terror ended by superior skill and desperate courage. Silence settled over the canyon like a shroud. Clara emerged from her hiding place on unsteady legs, her refined dress torn and dirty but her spirit unbroken. Elias approached carefully, his rifle still ready despite Garrett's obvious death. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm alive," Clara replied, and suddenly that seemed like the most important thing in the world. "Thanks to you." They stood facing each other across the body of the man who'd threatened to destroy everything they might have built together. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and the knowledge that they'd both risked everything for something that neither fully understood. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse he'd carved during the long winter nights. "Made this for little Sarah Wickham," he said quietly. "Thought you might want to give it to her when we get back." Clara took the tiny figure, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship that revealed so much about the man who'd created it. "You have gentle hands for someone so dangerous," she observed. "Had to learn to be both," Elias replied. "Gentle enough to carve toys, dangerous enough to protect what matters." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon behind, Clara realized that her mother's cameo brooch, the symbol of her refined past, had been lost somewhere during the struggle. But looking at the simple wooden horse in her palm, she found she didn't mind. Some things, she was learning, were worth more than the treasures of the past. Sheriff Tom Bradley's badge gleamed dully in the lamplight of his office as he pinned it to Elias McCord's buckskin vest. The old lawman's hands shook slightly, whether from emotion or the pain of his wounds, Clara couldn't tell. What she could see was the weight of responsibility passing from one man to another, like a torch being handed down through generations of those who chose to stand between civilization and chaos. "Been wearing this star for 15 years, Tom said, his voice hoarse from the bullet that had grazed his throat during the ambush. "Never thought I'd be handing it over like this." The attack had come at dawn, 3 days after Elias brought Clara back from Devil's Canyon. The Garrett gang, it turned out, had been larger than anyone suspected. Jake Garrett's death had only eliminated the advance team. The real threat came from his brother Cole and 8 hardened outlaws who'd been waiting in the hills north of town for word that Cedar Ridge was secure. When that word never came, Cole Garrett had decided to take the town by force, leading his men in a coordinated assault that caught the community completely off guard. The attack had been swift and brutal, designed to break resistance before it could organize. Sheriff Bradley had been shot down in the first minutes, along with 2 townsmen who'd tried to rally a defense. Only Elias's wilderness-honed reflexes had prevented a complete massacre. He'd been at the livery stable when the shooting started, and his tactical response had turned a rout into a fighting retreat. But the cost had been too high for a community that had never asked for war. "This isn't your fight," Clara said quietly, as Elias adjusted the unfamiliar weight of the badge. "You don't owe this town anything." Elias looked at her with those steady grey eyes that had first captured her attention. "Maybe not. But I owe you something, and you care about these people. That makes it my fight." The transformation in him was subtle but unmistakable. The mountain hermit was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more purposeful. Clara could see glimpses of the man he'd been before Sarah's death, someone accustomed to leadership and the weight of other people's lives. Besides, he continued, Cole Garrett won't stop with Cedar Ridge. He'll keep moving, keep killing, until someone stops him permanently. Might as well be here, might as well be now. Doc Peterson looked up from where he was tending Sheriff Bradley's wounds. The nearest federal marshals are in Cheyenne, 3 days' ride if the weather holds. We sent word with the morning stage, but 3 days might as well be 3 years, Elias finished. Garrett won't wait. He'll hit us again tonight, probably around midnight, when he thinks we'll be tired and careless. Martha Henley set down a tray of coffee cups with more force than necessary. So what do we do? Half the men are talking about loading their families in wagons and heading for Fort Collins. Running won't solve anything, Elias said firmly. Garrett's got 8 men and a grudge. He'll hunt down anyone who runs, pick them off one by one on the open prairie. Our only chance is to make our stand here, where we know the ground and can control the approaches. Pastor Williams spoke up from his corner near the window. You're talking about turning our town into a battlefield. It's already a battlefield, Elias replied. Question is whether we fight or surrender. Clara found herself thinking about her students, scattered to homes throughout the territory as their families fled or prepared for siege. Little Sarah Wickham's family had been among the first to load a wagon, heading south toward her uncle's ranch near Colorado Springs. Tommy Patterson's father had barricaded his house and sworn to fight, while Mary Wickham's mother wept openly as she cleaned her late husband's rifle. What about the women and children who can't leave? Clara asked. Church basement, Elias said without hesitation. Stone foundation, thick walls, only one entrance. We can defend it if everything else goes wrong. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation that transformed Cedar Ridge from a peaceful frontier town into an armed camp. Men who'd spent their lives farming and storekeeping learned to stack sandbags and create killing fields. Women who'd never touched weapons beyond kitchen knives practiced loading rifles and pistols under Doc Peterson's patient instruction. Clara found herself appointed to coordinate the defense of the church, a responsibility that would have terrified her 3 months ago, but now felt like a natural extension of her teaching duties. Instead of helping children with arithmetic, she was helping their mothers prepare for the possibility of widowhood. As afternoon faded into evening, Elias made his rounds of the defensive positions like a general inspecting his troops. But these weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary people who'd chosen to risk everything rather than surrender their homes to outlaws and murderers. You know, this could go badly, Clara said, when he stopped by the church to check on the women's preparations. Could, Elias agreed, but it could also go very well. And either way, these people will know they didn't go down without a fight. Is that enough? Is that worth dying for? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains that had been his home for so many years. I used to think the only thing worth dying for was something you'd already lost. Turns out I was wrong. Before Clara could ask what he meant, a shout from the street interrupted them. One of the lookouts had spotted riders approaching from the north, not the full gang, but 3 men carrying a white flag. Cole Garrett looked like a harder, meaner version of his dead brother. Where Jake had possessed a certain rough charisma, Cole radiated pure malevolence, the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of taking what he wanted and killing anyone who objected. "You've got something that belongs to me," he called out when he was still 50 yards from the main street. "My brother's body and his personal effects. I'm here to collect them." Elias stepped out into the street, his hand resting easy on the butt of his Colt. "Your brother's in the ground where he belongs. As for his effects, what makes you think a dead outlaw's property is worth more than the lives of innocent people?" Cole's smile was cold as winter stone. "Because I've got 8 good men who'll burn this town to the ground if I give the word. You want these people to live. You give me what I came for, and throw in that schoolmarm as compensation for my trouble." "Counteroffer," Elias said calmly. "You ride out now, and I'll let you keep breathing until the federal marshals catch up with you." The laugh that erupted from Cole Garrett was like breaking glass. You think that tin star makes you something special? I've killed more lawmen than you've probably met. Maybe, but you've never killed me. The parley ended there, with threats hanging in the air like gun smoke. As the three outlaws rode back toward their hidden camp, everyone in Cedar Ridge understood that the real battle was still to come. He'll attack at midnight. Elias told the assembled defenders as full darkness settled over the town. Classic outlaw tactic: wait until people are tired and jumpy, then hit fast and hard from multiple directions. "How do you know so much about outlaw tactics?" asked Jim Patterson, Tommy's father. Elias was quiet for a moment, and Clara saw something flicker across his face, old memories surfacing like fish in dark water. "Learned a few things during the war. Tactics don't change much, whether you're fighting Confederates or outlaws." It was the first time he'd mentioned his past as a soldier, and Clara filed the information away with all the other pieces of the puzzle that was Elias McCord. There were depths to this man that would take years to explore, assuming they lived long enough to have years together. As the defenders took their positions and the town settled into an uneasy quiet, Clara realized that Sheriff Bradley's badge represented more than just authority. It represented the willingness to stand between chaos and order, to risk everything for people who might never fully understand the price of their safety. Tomorrow, if they survived, Cedar Ridge would be different. They all would be different. But tonight, they stood together against the darkness, and that would have to be enough. Elias's hunting knife gleamed in the moonlight as he checked its edge for the third time in an hour. The blade was horn-handled and razor-sharp, forged by a German smith in Santa Fe and carried through 15 years of frontier life. It had skinned elk and carved toys, defended his life, and taken others when necessary. Tonight, it might be called upon to do both. The knife represented everything he'd learned about survival in hostile country, that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to steel and the will to use it. But more than that, it represented his readiness to embrace violence if it meant protecting what he'd discovered was worth protecting. Clara watched him from across the church, where the women and children had gathered for safety. Even in the dim lamplight, she could see the transformation that had overtaken him since accepting the sheriff's badge. The mountain hermit was gone, replaced by someone harder and more focused, a man preparing for war. "He's done this before," Martha Henley whispered, following Clara's gaze. "Look at the way he moves, the way he checks his weapons. That's not a trapper or a cowboy, that's a soldier." Clara nodded, remembering fragments of conversation that had hinted at Elias's past. The way he'd known how to organize the town's defenses, his understanding of tactics and timing, these weren't skills learned from hunting deer in the high country. "What do you think he was before he came to the mountains?" asked Emily Patterson, cradling her infant son while her husband prepared to fight in the streets above. "Someone who understood that leadership means making choices other people can't," Clara replied quietly. "Someone who learned that protecting what you love sometimes requires becoming something you'd rather not be." Outside, the town had settled into the peculiar quiet that preceded violence. Men crouched behind barricades and in doorways, their rifles loaded and their nerves stretched tight as piano wire. The saloon had been abandoned, its swinging doors moving gently in the night breeze, like pendulums marking time until the storm broke. Elias made his final rounds, checking positions and calming nerves, with the kind of steady presence that came from experience under fire. At the livery stable, he found Jim Patterson white-knuckling his old army musket. "Haven't shot this thing since Antietam," Jim confessed. "Not sure I remember how." "It'll come back to you when you need it," Elias assured him. "Just remember to aim low. Men on horseback look bigger than they are, and most folks shoot high in the dark." At the general store, he found Doc Peterson and two other men positioned behind overturned tables. The doctor had traded his medical bag for a Winchester and looked grimly determined to use it. "Any word from the lookouts?" Doc asked. "Nothing yet. But they're coming. You can feel it in the air." And he could. The same electric tension that had preceded every battle he'd ever fought, the sense of violence gathering like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Some men developed an instinct for such things, an ability to read the subtle signs that marked the transition from peace to war. As midnight approached, Elias found himself thinking about Sarah and the life they'd shared in the mountains. She'd known about his past as a cavalry officer, had listened without judgment as he'd told her about Shiloh and Chickamauga, about leading men into battles that left half of them dead and the survivors forever changed. War doesn't end when the shooting stops, she'd observed once while they watched snow fall outside their cabin. It just moves inside, where folks can't see it. She'd been right, of course. The war had continued inside him for years after Appomattox, a cold conflict between the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. Only in the absolute solitude of the high country had he found something approaching peace. But now, preparing to fight again, he realized that peace without purpose was just another kind of death. Sarah would have understood that, would have approved of his choice to risk everything for a woman whose courage matched her own. The attack came at 12:30, announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and the wild yells of men drunk on violence and their own sense of invincibility. Cole Garrett had divided his force into 3 groups, 2 hitting the main street from opposite ends, while the third circled around to attack the church from behind. It was a sound, tactical plan that would have worked against most frontier towns. But Cole Garrett had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed he was facing frightened civilians rather than a community organized by someone who understood warfare. The first shots came from the lookouts positioned on the rooftops, disciplined fire that dropped 2 horses and sent the lead group of attackers scrambling for cover. Return fire splintered wooden signs and shattered windows, but the defenders had prepared their positions well. From the church basement, Clara could hear the battle developing above the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns, and underneath it all, the shouts of men fighting for their lives and the lives of those they protected. "How long will it last?" young Emily Patterson asked, her voice barely audible above the gunfire. "Until one side runs out of ammunition or nerve," Martha Henley replied with the grim practicality of a woman who'd lived through Indian raids and blizzards. "Either way, it won't be long." But Clara found herself thinking about Elias, somewhere in that chaos of muzzle flashes and cordite smoke, leading men who'd never asked to be soldiers but had chosen to fight anyway. The mountain man who'd kissed her behind a freight wagon seemed like someone from another lifetime, replaced by a warrior whose skills had been forged in the crucible of America's bloodiest conflict. The third group's attack on the church came exactly as Elias had predicted, a desperate rush through the darkness, hoping to overwhelm the defenders with speed and surprise. But the women waiting in the basement had prepared for this moment, and when the outlaws burst through the main doors, they found themselves facing not helpless civilians, but armed defenders who'd chosen to fight rather than surrender. Clara's rifle spoke twice in the lamplight, the recoil jarring her shoulder but her aim steady. Beside her, Martha Henley worked the lever of her Winchester with mechanical precision, while Emily Patterson proved that protecting one's child could transform even the gentlest soul into something fierce and uncompromising. The fight for the church lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was 5 minutes that transformed everyone involved. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay dead on the sanctuary floor, and the women of Cedar Ridge had discovered something about themselves they'd never suspected. In the street, the main battle was reaching its climax. Cole Garrett's carefully planned assault had devolved into a series of individual firefights as his men found themselves trapped between prepared positions and disciplined crossfire. The advantage of numbers meant nothing when those numbers were scattered and confused. Elias had positioned himself at the heart of the defense, moving between positions as the situation demanded, rallying men when they faltered and directing fire where it was most needed. This was what he'd been trained for during 4 years of war, not just to fight, but to lead others in fighting, to make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and defeat. When Cole Garrett himself appeared at the end of the main street, silhouetted against the flames of a burning wagon, Elias knew the moment of final reckoning had arrived. Everything that had happened, Sarah's death, his years of exile, his rescue of Clara, the acceptance of the sheriff's badge, had led to this confrontation between two men who understood that some conflicts could only be resolved through violence. As he checked the loads in his Colt and loosened the hunting knife in its sheath, Elias McCord prepared to discover whether redemption was something that could be earned at gunpoint or whether some sins were too deep to be washed away by blood, no matter how righteously shed. The battle for Cedar Ridge was about to reach its conclusion, and with it, the question of whether love could triumph over violence, or whether some fights were too important to be won without becoming the very thing you were fighting against. In the church basement, Clara whispered a prayer for the man who'd shown her that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the gentlest souls carried the heaviest burdens. Above her, gunfire continued to echo through the night, marking time until dawn revealed who had paid the ultimate price for the right to call Cedar Ridge home. Clara's dress was torn and stained with blood that wasn't her own, but she fought with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her cubs. The blue silk that had once marked her as a refined Eastern lady was now battle-scarred evidence of her transformation into something harder and more resolute. When the outlaws had breached the church, she'd discovered reserves of courage she'd never known existed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like an angry mule, but her aim remained steady as she helped drive back men who'd never expected resistance from women and children. "Mrs. Patterson, take Emily and the baby to the back room," Clara called out as gunfire erupted again from the street above. "The rest of you, reload and check your ammunition." Martha Henley wiped blood from a cut on her forehead, where splinters from a shattered pew had found their mark. "Never thought I'd be fighting for my life in the Lord's house," she muttered, working fresh cartridges into her Winchester. "I don't think the Lord minds, given the circumstances," Clara replied, surprised by her own calm. 3 months ago, she'd been teaching children their letters. Tonight, she was commanding women in battle, and the transition felt as natural as breathing. Outside, the sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic, but more intense, as if the battle was concentrating into fewer but deadlier confrontations. Through the broken church windows, Clara could see muzzle flashes, painting the darkness in brief, violent bursts of light. A new sound reached them, the heavy thud of boots on the church steps, followed by Cole Garrett's voice, cutting through the night like a rusty blade. "Ladies, I know you're in there, and I know you've got ammunition, but you can't stay holed up forever. Come out peaceable, and maybe some of you live to see morning." Clara exchanged glances with Martha, both women understanding that surrender meant death, just delivered with more cruelty and less honor. The outlaws hadn't ridden hundreds of miles to take prisoners, they'd come to send a message written in blood and terror. "What's your answer, schoolmarm?" Garrett called out. "I know you're the one giving orders in there. Educated women always think they're smarter than everyone else." Instead of responding with words, Clara answered with her rifle, sending a bullet through the broken window that splintered wood inches from Garrett's head. The outlaw leader's laughter echoed off the church walls, but there was less confidence in it than before. Meanwhile, in the street, Elias moved through the smoke and shadows like a ghost seeking vengeance. His Colt spoke twice, dropping one of Garrett's men who'd been trying to flank the defenders at the general store. The hunting knife at his belt remained unused but ready, waiting for the moment when gunpowder and lead would give way to steel and determination. The tactical situation was improving. Of Garrett's original 8 men, 3 were confirmed dead and 2 more badly wounded. But the survivors were the most dangerous, hardened killers who'd been pushed past their breaking point and had nothing left to lose. Doc Peterson appeared at Elias's side, his medical training forgotten in favor of the Winchester that had belonged to his father. Garrett's holed up in the saloon with 2 men. They've got good cover and all night to wait us out. Not if I can help it, Elias replied, checking his ammunition. 6 rounds in the Colt, a dozen more on his belt, and the knife that had never failed him when the situation turned desperate. A commotion from the direction of the church drew their attention. Smoke was beginning to seep from the building's broken windows, and the smell of burning wood carried on the night breeze. "They're trying to burn them out," Doc Peterson said grimly. Elias felt a cold fury settle over him, the kind of killing rage that had carried him through the worst moments of the war. Clara and the other women were trapped in that burning building, faced with the choice between fire and bullets, both equally fatal. "Cover me," he told Doc Peterson, then sprinted across the open street toward the church. Bullets whined around him, but his focus was absolute, narrowed to the single objective of reaching the women before the fire did. He burst through the church's main doors to find chaos. Smoke filled the sanctuary, and flames were licking up the walls where someone had thrown burning brands through the windows. In the basement, he could hear Clara's voice calling out orders, still calm, despite the growing inferno above. "Down here!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the smoke and confusion. Clara appeared at the basement entrance, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes bright with determination. Behind her came Martha Henley and the other women, carrying children and helping the wounded. "The back wall," Elias said quickly. "There's a door that leads to the cemetery. We can get you out, but we have to move now." As they began the desperate evacuation, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Cole Garrett had positioned his remaining men to catch them in a crossfire as they emerged from the burning church, turning their escape into another deadly trap. But Clara Davenport had learned something important during her months on the frontier. Sometimes survival required becoming someone you'd never expected to be. And tonight, surrounded by fire and violence, she was ready to become exactly that. Jake Garrett's silver spurs lay scattered in the dust beside his brother's body, their ornate Mexican designs catching the first rays of dawn breaking over Cedar Ridge. The spurs had been a symbol of Cole Garrett's arrogance, stolen from a wealthy rancher in Colorado and worn as trophies of his contempt for law and order. Now they were just metal in the dirt, marking the end of a reign of terror that had claimed too many lives. The final confrontation had come as the church burned behind them, casting dancing shadows across the cemetery where generations of Cedar Ridge's dead lay in peaceful rows. Elias had emerged from the smoke, carrying little Sarah Patterson, while Clara led the other women to safety among the weathered headstones. Cole Garrett had been waiting for them, positioned behind a marble monument with his rifle ready and murder in his eyes. The outlaw leader's face was streaked with soot and blood, his clothes torn from the night's fighting, but his aim remained steady as death itself. "End of the line, mountain man," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd never lost a gunfight. "You've cost me everything, my brother, my men, my reputation. Time to pay the bill." Elias set Sarah Patterson gently behind a large headstone, then turned to face the man who'd brought war to a peaceful town. His hand rested easy on his Colt, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who understood that this moment would define everything that came after. "Your brother chose his path," Elias replied calmly. "Same as you, same as me. Difference is, I'm walking away from this, and you're not." The shot that followed came not from Garrett's rifle, but from Clara's position near the church wall. Her bullet struck the marble monument inches from Garrett's head, showering him with stone chips and destroying his concentration for the split second Elias needed. The mountain man's Colt cleared leather with the fluid motion of 15 years' practice, but Garrett was too faster than his brother had been, with the reflexes of a man who'd survived by being quicker than death itself. Both guns fired simultaneously, their reports echoing off the church walls and rolling across the cemetery like thunder. Garrett's bullet tugged at Elias's buckskin sleeve, drawing blood but missing anything vital. Elias's shot took the outlaw leader center mass, the heavy .45 caliber slug stopping him like he'd run into a stone wall. But Cole Garrett wasn't finished. Wounded and dying, he raised his rifle for one final shot, not at Elias, but at Clara, seeking vengeance against the woman whose courage had helped destroy his gang. The hunting knife left Elias's hand in a smooth, practiced motion, its horn handle warm from his grip. The blade caught the morning light as it spun through the air, covering the 20 feet between them in less than a heartbeat. It struck Cole Garrett just below the sternum, angling upward with the force and precision of a man who'd learned to throw knives during long winter nights when ammunition was scarce and practice was survival. The outlaw leader's rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky as he toppled backward, his reign of terror ended by 6 inches of German steel. Silence settled over the cemetery, broken only by the crackling of flames from the church and the distant lowing of cattle disturbed by the night's violence. Clara emerged from her position near the wall, her rifle still ready, but her hands steady despite everything she'd witnessed and done. "Is it over?" Martha Henley asked, rising from behind a headstone with her Winchester cradled in her arms. Elias walked to where Cole Garrett lay still, retrieving his knife and checking for signs of life. Finding none, he straightened and surveyed the battlefield that Cedar Ridge had become. The saloon was riddled with bullet holes, the church was burning, and there were bodies in the street that would need burying come full daylight. "It's over," he confirmed, holstering his Colt with hands that didn't shake, despite the violence they'd just dealt. Clara approached slowly, stepping carefully around the scattered debris of the night's fighting. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in Elias's eyes, the weight of command and violence that would never fully leave him. But there was something else there too, a peace that hadn't been present before, as if some long-carried burden had finally been set down. "The children?" he asked. "All safe." "Scared, but safe." Clara looked around at the destruction, at the women emerging from hiding places with weapons still in their hands. "We're all different now, aren't we?" "Yes," Elias agreed, "but different doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it means stronger." As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, the people of Cedar Ridge began the work of rebuilding their town and their lives. But they did so with the knowledge that they'd faced the worst humanity could offer and emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or numbers, but through the simple determination to protect what they loved. The silver spurs that had marked Cole Garrett's arrogance would be melted down and turned into something useful: belt buckles, perhaps, or bridal hardware. It seemed fitting that symbols of violence and pride should be transformed into tools of honest work. After all, that was what frontier life was really about, taking the raw materials of existence and forging them into something better than what came before. The wedding quilt spread across Clara and Elias's marriage bed was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship, sewn by the women of Cedar Ridge during the long winter months that followed the battle. Each square told a story. Martha Henley's contribution featured a schoolhouse surrounded by children's handprints, while Emily Patterson had embroidered a mountain scene that captured the view from Elias's old cabin. Clara traced the intricate stitching with gentle fingers, marveling at how something so beautiful could emerge from hands that had held rifles just 3 months before. The quilt represented more than wedding gift. It was the community's way of saying that love and creation could triumph over violence and destruction, that people who'd fought together could also build together. Outside their window, the rebuilt church bells rang the hour, their bronze voices carrying across a town that looked much the same as before, but felt fundamentally different. The new church was larger than the old one, with stone walls and stained glass windows donated by grateful ranchers whose cattle had been saved from the Garrett gang's depredations. More importantly, it had been built by people who understood the value of what they were creating. "Hard to believe it's been 3 months, Elias said, adjusting the sheriff's badge on his vest. The star had taken on a comfortable weight during the winter, becoming less a burden and more a natural part of who he was becoming. "Harder to believe how much has changed," Clara replied, smoothing her simple wedding dress. She'd chosen blue wool instead of white silk, practical rather than ornate, suitable for a woman who planned to spend her life on the frontier rather than in drawing rooms. The changes went deeper than clothing and buildings. Clara's students had returned to school in November, but they were different children than the ones who'd fled in September. They'd seen their mothers fight and their fathers die, had learned that safety was something that had to be earned rather than assumed. But they'd also learned that courage was contagious, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. Little Sarah Wickham still treasured the wooden horse Elias had carved, but now she also knew how to load a rifle and had watched her mother use one to defend their home. Tommy Patterson spoke with quiet pride about his father's service in the town's defense, while Mary Wickham had taken up the serious study of medicine under Doc Peterson's tutelage. "You've taught them well," Elias observed, watching Clara arrange the last of her belongings in their shared dresser. "They're growing up to be the kind of people this country needs." "We all are," Clara replied. "Growing up, I mean. Learning what we're capable of when everything we care about is at risk." The wedding ceremony had been simple, conducted by Pastor Williams in the new church before the entire population of Cedar Ridge and half the surrounding territory. Clara had walked down the aisle alone, having no family present to give her away. But she'd felt supported by every person in the congregation, people who'd fought beside her and survived horrors that would have broken weaker souls. Elias had worn his best clothes, but kept the sheriff's badge in place, a reminder that their love had been forged in service to something larger than themselves. When they exchanged vows, the words carried weight that went beyond the traditional promises of marriage. They were pledging to build something together in a place where building required constant courage. Sheriff Tom Bradley, recovered from his wounds but walking with a cane, had performed the honor of pronouncing them husband and wife. The old lawman's eyes had been bright with tears as he watched the badge he'd worn for 15 years finally find a worthy successor. "Never seen two people more meant for each other," he'd whispered to Doc Peterson during the reception, "like they were made from the same piece of mountain stone." Now, as evening settled over their wedding day, Clara and Elias stood together at the window of their small house, the former teachers' quarters expanded and improved by willing hands. The view encompassed the entire town, from the rebuilt church to the new schoolhouse, from the general store to the sheriff's office, where Elias would report for duty tomorrow morning. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, slipping his arms around his wife's waist. "About leaving Boston? About coming west? About marrying a man who forgot what woman smelled like?" Clara leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid strength that had first attracted and now comforted her. "Not a single one. Even though life here will never be easy, even though there'll always be dangers we can't predict or control." Clara turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar as her own reflection. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against mountain snow and desert sun, while the scar on his jaw marked some long-ago encounter with violence. But there was peace in those grey eyes now, the kind of contentment that came from finding purpose beyond mere survival. "Especially because of those things," she said firmly. "Easy lives don't teach you what you're made of. They don't show you what you're capable of becoming." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the window. A group of Clara's students were playing in the street, their voices bright with the kind of joy that could only exist in places where safety had been earned rather than inherited. "Listen to that," Clara said softly. 3 months ago, those children were learning to hide from gunfire. Tonight, they're playing games in the street because they know we'll protect them. "We," Elias repeated, tasting the word like fine wine. "I like the sound of that." They stood together as darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, watching lamplight bloom in windows throughout the town. Each light represented a family that had chosen to stay, to rebuild, to trust in a future that required constant tending, but promised rewards that couldn't be measured in comfort or convenience. In the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the star-filled sky. Somewhere among those peaks lay the cabin where Elias had spent 10 years learning to live with grief. But that life seemed as distant now as Clara's existence in Boston, a necessary chapter in a story that had led them both to this moment, this place, this understanding of what love could become when it chose to serve something larger than itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new tests of the bond they'd forged in fire and sealed in commitment. But tonight, they had each other. They had their community, and they had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some promises were worth any price required to keep them.